If you know anything about Melbourne, you'll know that the most Melbourne thing in Melbourne is Flinders Street Station, hub of the suburban railway network and probably the city's most recognisable building. One of the best known features of this iconic structure is this set of clocks mounted under the main station entrance on the corner of Flinders and Swanston Streets. "Meet me under the clocks" is a famous Melbourne expression, and it's been a traditional meeting place for Melburnians for well over 100 years. In this video, we're going to take a little look at the history of the clocks, why some of them are outdated or wrong, and some lines are missing completely, and what purpose they actually serve in the public transport world of today. So, first of all, what are the clocks for? Well, they don't tell the time, like this one or this one. They show departure times of trains, with each clock showing the next departure for a specific line. There are 13 clocks in total, with 9 mounted above the main entrance, and 4 mounted off to the left above this side entrance. Each clock has a small brass plate reading Edmiston and O'Neill Engineers 1916, and I initially assumed that was when they were made, but apparently those plates just mark the date of an overhaul. From what I can tell, the clocks are actually much older, being imported from England way back in the 1860s. They were initially fitted to the original station building, and were relocated to the current building when it was completed in 1910. And this wasn't the only entrance to feature these clocks. There were also a full set mounted above the Elizabeth Street and De Grave Street entrances, but those ones didn't make it into the modern era. The way the clocks are labelled has changed many times over the years, as lines opened or closed or were extended. But at some point the updates stopped, and the clocks are now stuck somewhat in a previous time, so let's have a look at that. From left to right, the clocks currently show departures for the Lilydale line, Belgrave, Glen Waverley, Alamein, Pakenham and Cranbourne, Frankston, Sandringham, Williamstown, Altona, St Albans, Broadmeadows, Upfield and Werribee. Now, the St Albans and Broadmeadows lines are no longer called that. St Albans was extended to Sydenham in 2002 and again to Sunbury in 2012. And in fact, trains can't even terminate at St Albans anymore. The Broadmeadows line was extended to Craigieburn in 2007. These clocks do display departure times for Sunbury and Craigieburn, but the lettering has never been updated to reflect the new line names. It might be reasonable to assume that these haven't been changed due to heritage concerns, but if we look at some of the other clocks, we can see that probably isn't the case. Werribee has its own clock, which only joined the suburban network in 1983, and the St Kilda and Port Melbourne line clocks were replaced when those lines closed in 1987. In fact, looking at old pictures, those two lines were on the two clocks at the right-hand end, so the current Werribee line clock is the old St Kilda line one. Meanwhile, over at the other end of the main entrance, we have a clock for the Pakenham and Cranbourne lines. Cranbourne only became a suburban terminus when it was electrified in 1995, and that appears to be the most recently updated clock. So, if the clocks are preserved, they're preserved in 1995 condition. Incidentally, or maybe not, the network was privatised between then and the next line extension. I have no idea if those two facts are connected, but certainly the clocks are frozen in time at the end of government operation. Another glaring anomaly is that there are two lines which don't have a clock at all, being the Mernda and Hurstbridge lines. This is because before the City Loop opened in the early 80s, those two lines used to depart from a separate station known as Prince's Bridge, which was across the road, and presumably they had their own departure clocks over there, but they were never added to the main Flinders Street display after Prince's Bridge closed. So how easily could they be updated to reflect the modern era? Well, actually very easily. While maintaining the current heritage style, the first step would be updating the two lines which have been extended, changing St Albans to Sunbury and Broadmeadows to Craigieburn. What to do with the Hurstbridge and Mernda lines is a slightly more difficult question if we assume there's no space to just add two more clocks. I would suggest combining the Altona and Werribee clocks, as these essentially operate as the one line today, and there's already a precedent for combining lines with Pakenham and Cranbourne. Then I'd combine the Belgrave and Lilydale clocks. It's not ideal, but they are interlined all the way out to Ringwood, and I don't think there's a better candidate. That would give us two free clocks to use for Mernda and Hurstbridge, and then we'd be pretty much aligned with the current situation. Alternatively, the Pakenham, Cranbourne and Sunbury lines are all going to disappear from this station when the Melbourne Metro Tunnel opens in a couple of years' time, so that will free up some clocks for better reorganisation then. Now, the clocks are double-sided. You can read them from inside while queuing at the booking office, for anyone who still does that, as well as from the outside. On the inside, you can see each clock has a small hole at the base. This is because the clocks were originally operated manually by a dude with a long metal pole who changed each clock as required, and that would have been a full-time job. But in 1983, the year the Victorian Railway ceased to exist, the clocks were automated, and today they're synchronised with the live departure information just like any other display. Legend has it that there was an attempt to replace them with an electronic display in the 80s and the clocks were taken down, but the public outrage was so great that they put them back up the very same day. So how well do the clocks actually work at the moment? Are they accurate? As a commuter on one of the lines that doesn't currently have a clock, I must confess I'd never paid all that much attention to them. So as a bit of a sample to test their accuracy, I stopped by Flinders Street after work one day and photographed all the clocks over a short period at 3:30 in the afternoon on a weekday. And here's what I found. Of the 13 clocks, a grand total of 4 of them were showing the correct time for the next train on that line on both sides of the clock. Those were Werribee, Broadmeadows, Williamstown and Sandringham. 2 of the clocks, Frankston and Altona, were just showing 12 o'clock on both sides. I assume this is the default position when the clock isn't receiving any data. For the Frankston line, this is because trains were being replaced by buses on the day of my visit, which is a level of nuance not easy to show on a clock. Altona doesn't have such a good excuse. In the mid-80s, the Altona line was joined up with the Werribee line, forming a loop, and today the Altona loop is considered part of the Werribee line and is included on Werribee line timetables. My guess is that this clock just hasn't been set up to get its data from the Werribee line, but really it should just show the next train running via Altona. In this case it should be showing 3:46. Now, I assumed that the 2 sides of each clock would be mechanically linked, effectively each a single clock with 2 faces. However, 6 of the clocks were showing a different time on either side during my visit. The Pakenham Cranbourne and the Alamein clocks were both showing the correct next departure outside, but sitting on the default 12 o'clock inside. Meanwhile, Upfield, St Albans and Glen Waverley were all correct inside the building, but oddly showing 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock outside. The Belgrave clock was showing 3:38 on both sides, which doesn't match up with any departure to Belgrave, but there is a 3:38 Blackburn, which is on the Belgrave line, so it might have been referencing that. Back when the clocks were operated manually, there was additional information about specific trains displayed under each clock, which would have been able to tell us it's a Blackburn train, but these didn't make it into the automated era. Finally, we have the Lilydale clock, which was by far the most confused. It was showing 3:44 outside and 3:51 inside. Neither of those times were the next departure to Lilydale, which was due out at 3:36. There was a 3:44 departure, but it's a Belgrave train, so maybe it's looking at that. And 3:51 is correct for the next Lilydale departure after overlooking the 3:36. Now, you might assume that some of these discrepancies were due to late running, but I cross-referenced this information with other live sources on the day, and all those trains were running on time. So, in summary, 4 clocks were fully correct, 5 were right on one side only, and the rest were complicated. All the outside clocks also have a little platform indicator, and most of those seem to be accurate, except the Glen Waverley and Frankston ones were blank, the Altona one was blanked out, and the Upfield one was showing platform lowercase a, which should be showing 5. A week later I went past again at the same time, and the situation was basically the same, except the outside Lilydale clock had now crashed to 12 o'clock, and a shoe had appeared between the Belgrave and Glen Waverley lines. So I think it's safe to say that in their current state, the clocks are fairly inaccurate and probably not playing a significant role in presenting useful information to passengers. The original concept was a good one. The clocks are clearly visible from across the street, and regular passengers would no doubt memorise the position of the relevant clock, and it would let you know if you needed to rush for your train or not as you approach the station. Of course, for the clocks to be meaningful, you also need to know what time it is, and for that you need to look all the way up to this clock here, which isn't easy to do when you're standing right in front of the station. The clocks date from a time when many people would have had a wrist or pocket watch, which would have made for an easy comparison, and of course today most people would be pulling out their phone. But it seems to me that the clocks would be a lot more usable if there was a clock showing the time much closer to them, like maybe right here. They also date from an era when average literacy was much lower, and a simple clock in a predictable position would have been much easier for the average person to interpret than the modern displays, which are jam-packed with text and additional information. Of course, today something of the opposite problem may exist, where literacy rates are very high, but the number of people who can fluently read an analog clock with Roman numerals would be slowly declining. Another usability issue is the position of the 4 clocks around the corner. It's a bit out of the way and not many people actually approach the building from that angle, but to be fair, I can't see many better places to put them. I should clarify that I doubt anyone is actually relying on these clocks for their departure information. There's a modern digital display just beyond the clocks, and another one just beyond the ticket barriers. Finally, when researching this video, I had one last question. That famous phrase, "meet me under the clocks," does anyone actually do that anymore? As a lifelong Melburnian, I can honestly say I don't think I've ever arranged to meet anyone there, and I kind of assumed that it's something that would have died out with the advent of mobile phones. However, I asked around friends and family, and apparently my experience is atypical. Nearly everyone said they used it as a meeting place at some point. And then, while filming some time lapses for this video, intended just as general filler footage, I noticed something quite remarkable. Sped up, it becomes very obvious that the meeting place is still alive and well, with an almost constant stream of people arriving alone, then departing with another person or group.
In the gloom, away towards the lighthouse, beaming over crashing waves that tumble through my head, calling out your names, but they are taken by the wind. And when I'm with the people that I hold so dear, they shield my thoughts from opening Pandora's box. I forget.
So, the Flinders Street clocks are an iconic Melbourne feature that might be a good place to meet a friend, but aren't really doing the job they were designed for anymore. However, it would only take a few small changes to transform them from a snapshot of the mid-90s to something that might actually be useful again. If you'd like to learn more about the history of the Flinders Street building, I highly recommend this book, which includes a chapter covering the departure clocks. Thanks to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible, and thanks for watching.
It's all shattered now at your top.